As we prepared this report, which was intended to discuss how the Russian military brought down the city of Bakhmut, a name now known by the small as much as by the great, we spent a long time selecting an appropriate title to accompany it. One striking observation during our research was the way the Russian forces manipulated the battlefield to secure victory in one of the most stubborn Ukrainian cities. We could find no description more fitting for the Russian army and its affiliated forces than the Merciless army. This term was further endorsed by a social media user who, commenting on a report about the city's fall, urged the world to heed these details before considering a war against Russia. We in turn have decided to present our esteemed Arab audience with detailed accounts of the events, and we now tell you the story of Bakmoot, now dubbed the New Stalingrad. Before we begin, for those unfamiliar with the history of Stalingrad, note that this Russian city has now reclaimed its historic name, Volgograd. Its reputation was forged during World War II when one of the most famous battles between the Russians and the Germans took place there, if not the most famous battle of all. The city earned the title of the Heroic City, though in truth it was not heroic in the literal sense. Indeed, while it withstood siege for 6 months, it eventually disappeared, a term you will understand after we recount how events unfolded, repeating themselves in another place, namely in Bakhmut in eastern Ukraine. We begin our narrative on the night of February 24, 2022, when Russian President Vladimir Putin went on television to announce that his country had decided to launch what was then called a special military operation in Ukraine. He defined its objectives as stripping Ukraine of its weaponry and eradicating those bearing Nazi names. The war began with the entry of Russian forces into the Donbas region, the center of the Russian-Ukrainian dispute, which had long been primed for a Russian incursion due to the presence of their armed group since 2014. At that time, the Kremlin grew increasingly convinced that the battle in Ukraine, like other modern conflicts Russia had fought, such as in Georgia, the initial 2014 Ukraine war, the Caucasus conflicts before that, and even in Syria, would be short-lived, that Russia would fully achieve its goals and declare victory. However, subsequent events brought the Russians back to reality and reminded them that not all wars are the same. It was not part of their plans for the conflict to escalate into an all-out war. For those who know the early details of the war, it was clear that the Russians intended a clean conflict, one in which no civilians would be killed and no cities, installations, or institutions would be destroyed. Many factors influenced this approach, foremost among them being that the Ukrainian people are, historically, cousins to the Russians, essentially one people. Moreover, the Kremlin had planned for a pro-Russian regime in Kiev, so they did not wish to destroy their neighbor, but merely bring it back into submission. Nevertheless, the Russians encountered a strong reaction from the Ukrainian military, which received unceasing support from the West and NATO. As a result, the financial, human, and psychological costs of the war escalated dramatically, and the Russian conception of Ukrainian cities changed after the annexation of the Donbas region. These cities were now regarded as Russian. We now speak of two major cities, Zaporozhye, home to Europe's largest nuclear reactors and a nuclear power station, and Bakhmut, the subject of our discussion. Zaporozhye fell due to its small size and nuclear sensitivity, but Bakhmut endured, becoming a symbol of the Russian military's new strategy. This new strategy has led us to label the Russian army as the Merciless army. It appears that after changing their military mindset, the Russians discarded traditional warfare rules in favor of a style that might be termed a war of attrition, one that leaves nothing behind. This approach avoids labeling them as barbaric while also preventing our narrative from becoming overly sentimental. Let us recount the facts as they unfolded. At the onset of the war, Moscow relied on a specific military formation known as the BTG, or Battalion Tactical Group, a maneuver that consolidated various branches of the Russian military into one unit. Typically, a BTG comprised a mechanized infantry battalion, usually made up of 2 to 4 companies, augmented by specialized units for air defense, artillery, engineering, logistics support, and a tank company. According to the Russian defense minister, until August 2022, there were approximately 170 such formations operating in Ukraine, each consisting of around 800 soldiers, 10 tanks, and 40 armored vehicles. However, this formation eventually proved ineffective and led to significant Russian losses, necessitating a change. This change was first trialed in Bakhmut. In Bakhmut, the Russian forces shifted from relying on a single formation to establishing 4 categories of infantry: the specialized, the assault, the line, and the disposable. And the specialized soldiers were the most skilled and best trained, divided into snipers and heavy equipment operators. The assault troops were elite units such as paratroopers and naval infantry, among others. Next came the line infantry, who received less training and were deployed in roles that did not demand high combat skills, such as digging trenches, holding defensive positions, and supporting the more valuable specialized and assault units. Finally, the disposable category was composed almost of civilians, including locals from the Donbas loyal to Russia, as well as convicts who volunteered in exchange for their release. Armed with only light weapons, pistols, submachine guns, and assault rifles, these forces formed the lowest tier. This new tactical organization contributed to cost savings and reduced the overall budget, as expenditures increasingly focused on the specialized units and, to a lesser extent, the assault troops. Recall that the assault units also included the Wagner group forces. During the fighting in Bakhmut, the commander of the paratroopers accused the Russian Defense Ministry of depriving them of arms and support. This was because the ministry was prioritizing spending on the specialized units as part of an overall cost-saving strategy, which also involved reducing the number of artillery shells from over 60,000 daily rounds to 30,000 rounds per day. In doing so, the Russians took the first steps toward adapting by saving money and simultaneously reducing their own casualties. They once again fragmented their formations. Each battalion was subdivided into 4 smaller groups to lessen the human losses that were occurring due to Ukrainian drone strikes and the advanced munitions and shells supplied by NATO. During this period, the Russians also devised a new method to counter what was known as the drone inferno. They managed to shoot down more than 10,000 drones per month, a figure that crippled the main strength of the Ukrainians. If you are curious about this mechanism, know that it involved the use of advanced Russian systems, such as the Chepovinik arrow jamming station, which was installed every 10 kilometers along the front line. In this way, the Russians reasserted their grip on the battles in Ukraine. This method can be described as compartmentalization. It was not limited to fragmenting soldiers and equipment, but extended to the very domain of battle. Whereas at the beginning of the war, Russia had envisioned a comprehensive conflict over all Ukrainian territory. After these adaptations, they divided Ukraine into separate battlefields, each a self-contained engagement shaped by its own circumstances. The most important of these was Bakmoot, located in the northern part of a province roughly 65 kilometers north of Donetsk, the administrative center of a province that, along with Luhansk, forms the neighboring Donbas region. Bakhmut is about 15 kilometers from the Luhansk border and 500 kilometers from the capital, Kyiv. It lies on the main road leading to the cities of Lysychansk and Kramatorsk, 2 of the largest cities in the Donbas. Its proximity to the international M3 highway, which connects directly to Sloviansk and continues toward Kharkiv, further underlines its strategic importance. If the Russians won in Bakhmut, they would have firmly established control over their new territories in the Donbas. If Kyiv prevailed, it would mean that a part of Donbas remained Ukrainian, thus preserving its symbolic value. Due to this significance, both sides poured their strength into Bakhmut, where the battles extended over 224 days. At that point, securing victory in Bakhmut became critical for both parties, as they had incurred tremendous losses. After all those months and heavy casualties, it was illogical for one side to be easily defeated. The concept of breaking the bone on the battlefield was thus applied in Bakhmut. Throughout the war, Kyiv used Bakhmut as a symbol of its resilience, proudly broadcasting its continued fight there. At the same time, Moscow maintained that it was close to clinching the battle, although a decisive end did not come until May 21, 2023. Even before that, Moscow had marked a victory in a manner strikingly similar to what occurred 80 years earlier in Stalingrad. There, Moscow had handed over command to the Wagner forces, led by the militia founder Yevgeny Prigozhin, a man who understood only one language in war: destruction. He was indifferent to human losses, caring more about material damage. He adopted an old policy beloved by Russia known as scorched earth. Indeed, Prigozhin burned the land and everything on it, recording scenes of Ukrainian killings and the bodies of the dead, sending what remained to Kiev in a display more horrific than any found in horror films. He even ordered his men to shoot birds in the city. Rather than encircling buildings and wasting time, he commanded their destruction along with those inside, imposing curfews by day and instilling terror by night. Countless images and videos emerged showing the horror in Bakhmut, a city that came to be nicknamed the City of Death, among other titles. Ultimately, Bakhmut transformed into the decisive step that would determine the overall victor of the war. In the end, the Russians achieved their objectives and claimed victory. To bring you even closer to the picture, here are the words of the Ukrainian president, who admitted defeat while standing beside US President Biden at a summit held in Hiroshima, a city notorious for being destroyed by the American nuclear bomb during World War II, on the morning of the Russian victory. In his address, he stated unequivocally that Ukraine had lost the city, and that nothing remained there. The Russians had destroyed everything. He concluded by saying, "Today, Bakhmut exists only in our hearts. There is nothing left in this place." His words needed no further explanation, for they meant that nothing remained of Bakhmut except its name, a name that will forever remain in the hearts and memories of the Ukrainians and their soldiers. We dare not say that any survivors were left, for anyone who entered Bakhmut had virtually zero chance of leaving alive, as the stench of death overwhelmed not only the Ukrainians but also the Russians. To illustrate further, consider the figures announced by the Wagner commander himself, who claimed that he lost nearly 20,000 fighters, a staggering number. If these were the losses of the victorious Russians, imagine the toll on the Ukrainians, whose commander estimated over 100,000 casualties. That figure amounts to roughly 500 Ukrainians being slaughtered, amputated, or burned alive by the Russians every day during a period of about 100 days. The Western media has labeled these fighters as mercenaries. Speaking of mercenaries, the Wagner leader also revealed that nearly half of the fatalities among his troops were former convicts, ex-criminals released by the Russians and thrust into battle. From this, you understand, dear reader, who fought in Bakhmut. Soldiers, half of whom were hardened criminals, who spared no effort in inflicting death and destruction on the Ukrainians. This explains why we described the Russian military as the Merciless army, and why we felt compelled to repost that comment as a reminder to anyone who might consider matching wits with the Russians in a war as brutal as the one in Bakhmut.